Chapter 3. The Watershed Years, 1828-1830. The First Chronic Diseases and the Fourth Organon. The Introduction of Homeopathic Pathology. The Roman Greco school of medicine was obsessed with classifying disease states into pathological categories at the expense of their distinctive signs and symptoms. Their goal was to find concise disease names that could easily be related to specific types of medicine. Hahnemann taught that it was very counterproductive to force diseases into artificial arrangements on the basis of a few common symptoms. He opined that every disease has a singular nature that should be assessed by what is marked, uncommon, and unique about the patient's symptoms. Hippocrates taught that all diseases are constitutional in nature and only appear locally as a last resort to provoke crisis. Hahnemann held a similar view and integrated it into all the editions of the Organon. During the period of the first to third Organon, homeopathic case-taking was based primarily on the principles of similia and individualization, although the investigation of collective diseases had begun. Hahnemann was so disillusioned by orthodox pathology that he questioned the very idea of disease categories. See Aphorism 40 of the First Organon. The following quote is from the Organon of Medicine, 5th and 6th edition, by Samuel Hahnemann, Dudgeon and Borghi translation, the appendix, First Organon, Aphorism 40, page 194. But diseases, ailments, and dyscrasias are such infinitely varied phenomena that a useful classification of them is impossible, even should such a forced arrangement of them in separate classes appear essential for purposes of cure. End of quote. Hahnemann renounced the pseudo-causations and false disease names used by the allopaths. He felt it was misleading to classify disease solely by names like nephritis, gastritis, and Bright's disease. It is more important to study the signs and symptoms of the patient rather than to fall into conjectures about pathological titles. To him, each disease was a singular, unique event that needed individualized treatment. Samuel summed up his views in Aphorism 46. The following quote is from the Organon of Medicine, 5th and 6th edition, Samuel Hahnemann, the Dudgeon and Borghi translation, appendix, First Organon, Aphorism 46, page 195. Nature has no nomenclature or classification of diseases. She produces single diseases and demands that the true healing artist shall treat individually in his fellow creatures, not the systemic combination constituting a disease genus, a kind of confounding different diseases together, but each particular disease by itself. But she forbids the therapeutic treatment of composite groups of disease constructed by imaginative man instead of individual diseases, which she has wisely created as separate entities, thus crippling the divine work of healing. That is the end of the quote. The founder was quite pleased with the success of homeopathy in acute diseases and acute miasms, but by 1816 he was increasingly frustrated by the number of degenerative chronic cases that were resisting his treatment. See Chart 3.1, Timeline. The Chronic Diseases and the Fourth Organon. Hahnemann previously collected the symptoms of psychosis and syphilis and noticed similar patterns of characteristics. Once he had recorded the group symptoms, he was able to find remedies that acted curatively. This made the treatment of venereal diseases more consistent. Now Hahnemann was recording fundamental causes and collective miasms. As Hahnemann continued to treat non-venereal chronic patients, he noticed that many seemed to get better at first, but then slowly declined over time. No matter what remedies Samuel gave, the the patient did not seem to improve over the long run. He wrote of these prescriptions, quote, "Their beginning was promising, the continuation less favourable, and the outcome hopeless." The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part, Samuel Hahnemann, Nature of Chronic Diseases, page 25. "Still, such a favourable pause would never be of long duration, and the return and repeated returns of the complaints in the end left even the best selected homeopathic remedies then known, and given in the most appropriate doses, the less effective the oftener they were repeated. They served at last hardly even as weak palliatives." End of quote. This situation greatly troubled the founder because he knew his therapeutic system was incomplete. The application of his store of remedies was only palliating rather than curing non-venereal chronic diseases. He had some successes, but the overall trend was not encouraging. Perhaps the problem was the lack of suitable remedies for these chronic diseases. Although Samuel knew this was part of the dilemma, he was not completely satisfied with this answer. Why were some chronic patients cured while others were not? The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases Theoretical Part by Samuel Hahnemann, Nature of Chronic Diseases, page 25 to 26. "But usually, after repeated attempts to conquer the disease, which appeared in a form always somewhat changed, residual complaints appeared which the homeopathic medicines, hitherto proved, though not few, had to leave uneradicated, yea, often undiminished. Thus there ever followed varying complaints, ever more troublesome, and as time proceeded, more threatening, and this even while the mode of living was correct, and with the punctual observations of directions. The chronic disease could, despite all efforts, be but little delayed in its progress by the homeopathic physician, and grew worse from year to year." End of quote. Among all the hopeful signs, there was a rather large group of patients that were still resisting treatment. As Hahnemann watched the decline of these patients, he observed a common thread in the signs and symptoms of various sufferers. How could the, quote, "never-resting, preservative vital force," unquote, remove acute diseases with the aid of remedies, but not these chronic symptoms? The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part by Samuel Hahnemann, Nature of Chronic Diseases, page 27. "The answer to this question, which is so natural, inevitably led me to the discovery of the nature of these chronic diseases." End of quote. Hahnemann postulated that the cause of these chronic diseases was an unknown primitive miasma and set about to discover its nature. Over the next 12 years, Hahnemann worked on his new project in secret, not even telling his students. Samuel was now proving new remedies he thought might be effective, investigating the nature of individual and collective diseases, collating exciting and fundamental causes, studying acute, half-acute and chronic miasms, recording the effects of suppression, using exceedingly small doses, prescribing the decillionth potency, that is X30C, and developing a new case management philosophy. At this time it became obvious that the founder needed to develop a new system of homeopathic pathology to replace the outmoded allopathic model. Although Samuel's public writings taught that most illnesses were individual in nature, privately he was starting to question that hypothesis. The itch disease in early homeopathy. On the Venereal Disease and its Ordinary Improper Treatment, 1816, Hahnemann taught that syphilis was a chronic miasmatic disease caused by a, quote, virus. At this time, the word virus was a term used for infectious disease before the advent of modern viral theory. Samuel wrote that the eruption of the chancre was a sign that the whole organism was infected with the internal disease. The suppression of the chancre causes the internal syphilis to mutate into new destructive symptoms. He also points out that hydrophobia, and smallpox are of a similar miasmatic nature. He then takes up the subject of the chronic itch virus and its role in internal disease in detail. The following quote is from the lesser writings of Samuel Hahnemann, Dudgeon edition, on the venereal disease and its ordinary improper treatment, page 649. The last named disease belongs to the chronic exanthematous diseases, like the venereal disease, and in it nature also produces the itch vesicles, at first in the neighbourhood of the part that was originally touched by the itch virus, e.g. betwixt the fingers and on the wrist, if the hands, palms, were first infected. As soon as the itch vesicles have made their appearance, this is a sign that the internal itch disease is already fully developed. End of quote. In this early rendition of the itch miasm, Hahnemann points out that as long as the eruptions effloresce on the skin, the internal disease lies latent in a state of slumber. The external lesion acts as a pressure valve for the internal itch and slows down the spread of the miasma. The following quote is from the lesser writings of Samuel Hahnemann, Dudgeon edition, on the venereal disease and its ordinary and proper treatment, page 649. These itch vesicles are an abnormal organ produced by the inner organism upon the skin, designed by nature to be the external substitute of the internal disease, to take the latter upon itself, to absorb it, as it were, and so to keep it subdued, slumbering, and latent. End of quote. Hahnemann goes on to describe the outcome of suppressing the external lesions of the itch miasma. Even in this early work, the founder makes a direct connection between driving in the itch and the development of secondary symptoms like phthisis, apoplexy, dropsy, and insanity. In some cases, suppression even causes sudden death, often of an idiopathic nature. Samuel also noted that sulphur is a chief remedy in the treatment of the internal itch miasm. This completes the essential areas of study that would be elucidated in the chronic diseases. The following quote is from the lesser writings of Samuel Hahnemann, Dudgeon edition, on the venereal disease and its ordinary and proper treatment, pages 649 to 650. That this is the case is evident from this, that so long as the vesicles remain on the skin and continue to itch and discharge, the internal disease cannot make its appearance, and from this also, that whenever it is partially destroyed on the skin, without any previous cure being effected of the internal itch disease, especially if it be of somewhat long standing and have attained to any extent, by means of the internal employment of its specific remedy, sulphur, this internal disease then bursts forth rapidly, often in a frightful manner, in the form of phthisis, asthma, insanity, dropsy, apoplexy, amaurosis, paralysis, and it not unfrequently occasions sudden death. End of quote. During the founder's lifetime, public hygiene was so poor that soft tissue infections caused by mites, bacteria, fungi and viruses were epidemic. Most people suffered from the itch disease in a variety of manifestations at one time or another. The most common practice was to treat soft tissue infections as local diseases with topical creams. In Aphorism 41 of the Second Organon, 1819, Hahnemann noted the connection between the suppression of the itch disease and asthma as well as pulmonary phthisis. This shows a connection between psora and what was later identified as pseudopsora, the tubercular miasm. So even at an early date, the founder was recording the constitutional nature of the skin diseases and the negative effects of driving the itch inward. The following quote is from the Organon of Medicine, 5th and 6th edition, Dudgeon and Borgie translation, Appendix 2nd Organon, footnote, Aphorism 41, page 189. All the maladies which occur after the suppression of the eruption from the skin, after what is termed driving back the itch, the writings of many observers abound in such cases, are original symptoms proper to the itch disease, which remain latent as long as this disease draws off to the skin in the form of an eruption, and thus silences its internal affection. But they return as soon as this derivative channel is stopped by the topical drying up of the itch exanthem." End of quote. The German casebook D22 shows that as early as 1821, Hahnemann was marking the potential symptoms of Psora in his patients with the notation NB. Then he would collect the symptoms of the itch disease from his casebooks and transfer them into a manuscript form for his future publication on chronic diseases. For a period of 11 years, he observed the symptoms of Psora and investigated potential remedies for its treatment. He tested to see if sulphur would prove as universal in the treatment of Psora as mercury had in the treatment of syphilis, but he soon found out that Psora was a much more complicated disease. For this reason, Hahnemann experimented with the use of a chief remedy and an intercurrent medicine, the alternation of two remedies, and a series of remedies in sequence in an effort to remove Psora. He introduced a number of new antipsoric remedies, including many from the mineral world. He noted any new symptoms brought out on patients and integrated them with what was known from poisonings, older medical authorities, and provings on the healthy. These investigations formed the foundation for the next development in homeopathy, which was the systematic treatment of the chronic miasms. New remedies. In 1828, Hahnemann published the first edition of the chronic diseases, their peculiar nature and their homeopathic cure, commonly known as the chronic diseases. The chronic diseases consisted of 3 parts. Part 1 explained the theory of the miasms, and parts 2 and 3 described 15 remedies. Part 4 was added in 1830. This contained 2 new remedies and 5 from the Materia Medica Pura. This made a total of 22 remedies in the first edition. The second edition was published in sections. Parts 1 and 2 in 1835, Part 3 in 1837, Part 4 in 1838. The complete second edition, including a new Part 5, appeared in 1839. These second editions added 25 antipsoric remedies, of which 12 were from the Materia Medica Pura and 13 were new remedies. Hahnemann's final collection of 47 antipsorics contained 17 from Materia Medica Pura and 30 new remedies. The Tafel translation of the chronic diseases treats aurum muriaticum as a separate remedy, making 48 antipsoric medicines. The prefaces to these editions contain Hahnemann's latest insights into the function of the vital force in cure, the preparation of medicines, and recent posology experiments. Hahnemann had been using the terms inherent energy of the vitality, vital energy, and vital power since 1796. The principles of dynamism and vitalism are at the root of the original homeopathic paradigm. Hahnemann used the term the vital force, German Lebenskraft, in the first edition of the chronic diseases. The first edition of the chronic diseases contained 15 remedies that Hahnemann noted as anti-miasmatic remedies. The 15 remedies were ammonium carbonicum, boratia carbonica, calcarea carbonica, including calcarea aceticum, graphites, iodum, lycopodium, magnesia carbonica, magnesia muriaticum, natrum carbonica, nitricum acidum, petroleum, phosphorus, sepia, silica, and zincum. Sepia and silica had been included in the Materia Medica Pura, and the other 13 remedies were new additions. In the original volume, these remedies were published without a list of provers and observers as is found in the Materia Medica Pura. Hughes suggested that since Hahnemann was between 70 and 80 years old, it was unlikely that he was still proving remedies on himself. Secondly, he stated that as Hahnemann kept the Sora doctrine secret until he shared his ideas with Staff and Gross in 1827, he must also have kept the new remedies secret. For this reason, he opines that most, if not all, of the rubrics found in the first edition of the Chronic Diseases were observations of symptoms brought out in Hahnemann's patients. First of all, there is no direct evidence that Hahnemann proved absolutely no medicines between the years 1817 and 1828. Secondly, Hahnemann did not have to tell anyone his reasons for choosing to prove certain remedies, as this is not necessary for the collection of symptoms. It would have been impossible for Hahnemann to prescribe 15 new remedies for which he had absolutely no symptoms on which to base a prescription. He must have had at least a rudimentary collection of symptoms to administer these remedies on the ill in the first place. Then he could fill out the collection of symptoms based on the NB symptoms brought out on patients under treatment. Some have tried to use the fact that the founder used symptoms brought out on patients under treatment as an example that Hahnemann did not practice what he preached in the Organon. The truth is that Hahnemann had used this method since the time of the Materia Medica Pura, and he wrote about it in Aphorism 142 of the Organon. In the third volume of the Chronic Diseases, published in 1830, which makes up part 4 of the first edition, Hahnemann included 2 new medicines, Calicarbonicum and Natrum muriaticum. He also included 5 remedies that were already in the Materia Medica Pura, i.e. Carbo animalis, Carbo vegetabilis, Causticum, Conium and sulphur. There were originally 151 symptoms for sulphur in the Materia Medica Pura, which increased to 1,969 in the Chronic Diseases. There is little doubt that many of these new rubrics came from Hahnemann's observation of symptoms brought out in patients under treatment. Herring wrote in the Guiding Symptoms, under Calicarbonicum, quote, "Provings by Hahnemann, Gersdorf, Gouin, Hartlaub, Nenning, Rummel and Robinson," unquote. Herring also wrote that Natrum muriaticum was, quote, "introduced by Hahnemann, proved by himself, Foissac, Roll, Rummel, Schreiter and Nenning," unquote. Even Hughes admits that some of the symptoms of Natrum muriaticum are from Hahnemann's provings in the 30C potency. The founder used 2 terms to describe the collection of symptoms in the second edition of the Chronic Diseases, i.e., quote, "names of my fellow provers are," unquote, and, quote, "names of my fellow observers are," unquote. In the second edition, Hahnemann states that he proved sepia when he says that, quote, "the abbreviations of my fellow provers are Gill, Galoon, GFF von Gersdorf, GR Gross, HDH Hartlaub, WHL Wale," unquote. Herring confirms these facts in the Guiding Symptoms when he states that Hahnemann proved sepia along with Gersdorf, Galoon, Hartlaub, Wale and Gross. Herring also notes in the Guiding Symptoms that nitric acid was, quote, "introduced by Hahnemann, proved by himself," unquote, and then lists the names of other co-provers, including himself. Herring says phosphorus was, quote, "introduced by Hahnemann, proved by himself," and again states he was one of the co-provers. This data shows Hahnemann and Herring were both involved in proving the same remedies for the chronic diseases. The second edition of the Chronic Diseases ran from 1835 to 1839. On top of the 22 medicines contained in the first edition, the second edition added 25 remedies, out of which 13 are new and 12 appeared in the Materia Medica Pura. The 13 new remedies were agaricus, alumina, ammonium muriaticum, anacardium, antimonium crudum, borax, clematis, cuprum, euphorbium, merserium, nitrum, calinitricum, platina and sulfuricum acidum. The 12 older remedies were arsenicum, aurum, colocynth, digitalis, dulcamira, guaiacum, episulfuris, manganum, muriatic acidum, phosphoric acidum, sarsaparilla and stannum. Now that the entire subject was out in the open, the list of provers increased and the number of remedies and symptoms were expanded. Samuel Hahnemann was well aware that his new doctrine of the miasms and anti-miasmatic treatment was far ahead of his times. He knew that many would not understand the depth and breadth of what he was proposing, and that much of what he was saying would fall on deaf ears. In the author's preface to the first edition in 1828, Hahnemann wrote, following quoted from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part, Author's Preface to the first edition, 1828, page 7. But in communicating to the world this great discovery, I am sorry that I must doubt whether my contemporaries will comprehend the logical sequence of these teachings of mine, and will follow them carefully and gain thereby the infinite benefits for suffering humanity, which must inevitably spring from a faithful and accurate observance of the same, or whether, frightened away by the unheard-of nature of many of these disclosures, they will not rather leave them untried and uninitiated, and, therefore, useless. End of quote. The origin of Sora. The Chronic Diseases contains Hahnemann's first full dissertation on the constitution, predisposition, inheritance, the vital force, environmental conditioning, individual and collective diseases, and the chronic miasms. In this work, the founder introduced the first coherent system of epidemiology, the study of infectious miasms and their long-term effects. In Hahnemann's day, little was known about the processes of infection and its effect on the immune system. Nevertheless, Hahnemann was able to carefully record the primary, latent and secondary symptoms of the chronic miasms. Samuel also recorded the symptoms of a syndrome that is now called autoimmune disorders and immunodeficiency diseases. The homeopathic version of these diseases, however, is much more extensive and detailed. The publication of the chronic diseases marks the end of the developmental phase of homeopathy and the beginning of its definitive years. Hahnemann was now of the opinion that most chronic diseases were caused by collective miasms rather than individual disease states. Hahnemann wrote in 1828 that the itch miasm, psychosis and syphilis were the three miasms active in Germany in his time. He did not limit the number of possible miasms. He developed the collective anamnesis in such a manner that it could be used to assess acute, half-acute and chronic miasms and choose and find prophylactic and curative remedies. Homeopathy would now take into account the individual and collective aspects of disease and tailor the treatment strategy accordingly. The ancient Greek physicians used the term sora to describe a great variety of skin diseases. Sora means an itch, fault, pollution, or stigma. The internal concomitant symptoms of the itch miasm are called internal sora. The allopathic treatment for the itch diseases consisted of purging the patient with heroic remedies and treating the skin with sulphur, mercury, or lead ointments. This dubious method caused more harm than good by, quote, driving in the itch, unquote. After some contemplation, Samuel decided to call the new itch virus by its ancient name, Sora. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part, Nature of Chronic Diseases, page 35. Sora is that most ancient, most universal, most destructive, and yet most misapprehended chronic miasmic disease, which for many thousands of years has disfigured and tortured mankind. End of quote. Humanity has suffered from Sora, the ancient itch disease, since human beings lived as cave dwellers. This ancient disease tinder has been passed through millions of human beings over the millennia. Its inherited and acquired effects are found in every family tree and on every continent. Human beings have been plagued with soft tissue infections, numerous skin complaints and their internal effects for generations. The skin is the first line of defence and is intimately connected to the vital organs, nervous system and the immune system. Hahnemann's doctrine of Sora meant that skin diseases could no longer be viewed as local diseases and treated with topical applications. The suppression syndrome is intimately integrated with the theory of the miasms. When the primary lesions of the chronic miasms are suppressed, the diseases enter their latent phase. Occasionally, an exciting cause like mental stress, a physical trauma, unseasonable weather and the like will stimulate an acute-like flare-up of the internal sora, producing a localized crisis. Hahnemann explained the connection between acute-like diseases and the chronic itch miasm in a letter to staff in 1828. Samuel was commenting on the case of Staff's wife, who had suffered an attack of facial erysipelas. The following quote is from the Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 184. This was an example of the by no means rare explosions and sudden outbursts of the internal sora. These are always quite sudden illnesses, the cause of which, causa occasionalis, a chill, a fright, a vexation, etc., is often very insignificant. They only come singly. Therefore, I consider all maladies that occur epidemically and sporadically as belonging to this class. End of quote. Hahnemann goes on to say that this subject was not explained well enough in the first edition of the Chronic Diseases. This letter elucidates the relationship between many so-called acute diseases and shows that they are really a pathological crisis caused by the chronic miasms. Hahnemann implies that susceptibility to acute miasms and individual sporadic diseases are also based on sora. The following quote is from The Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 184. Those single outbursts of the internal latent sora, which I have not sufficiently described in my book, which may easily happen in the first edition of a book, after their speedy defervescence or rapid cure by proper means, allow the previously latent sora to return to its latent state, as we often see in the case of poor people that a sudden inflammatory swelling in some part, a sore throat, an ophthalmia, an erysipelas or other acute febrile disease, pleurisy, etc., comes on in a threatening manner, but if it does not kill the patient, often subsides by the help of nature, frequently by the formation of an abscess, and then the stream that had overflowed its banks returns to its bed, i.e. the sora again becomes latent, but with an increased disposition to repeat these or similar explosions. End of quote. The founder was not afraid to use words like pleurisy or ophthalmia to describe a set of symptoms, but such names were not sufficient for the prescription of medicine. These symptoms merely represent a chief location that needs to be filled out with a complete description of the accompanying signs and symptoms. An acute-like acerbation of sora can produce a dangerous state that either takes the life of the patient or produces a severe crisis, after which the patient slowly convalesces. However, this amelioration of the local symptoms only marks the return of sora to its latent state. These acute-like flare-ups will return and become worse as the internal disease grows. Over time, this latent state will evolve into secondary or tertiary diseases that attack the internal vital organs and systems, producing serious degenerative states and pathological crisis. The following quote is from The Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 184. It ought not to cause astonishment that for such very acute outbursts of latent sora, the antisoric remedies are not suitable. therefore, that Spiritus Vini Sulphuratus, or even Graphites, which is such an excellent homeopathic remedy for erysipelas of the face, was not suitable in the face erysipelas fever of your wife. These remedies are appropriate for the slow, radical cure of the causa prima of the face erysipelas. Now, the un-antisoric remedies, like Rustox in your case, which correspond to the present transient morbid picture, are the appropriate medicines. They can quickly quell the existing acute explosion, so that the condition calms down again into the latent sora, to which these remedies have little or no affinity. End of quote. Hahnemann clearly separated true acute diseases from pseudo-acute disorders caused by a flare-up of the soric miasm. They both represent acute-like states, but a true acute disease is caused by an external exciting cause, while a pseudo-acute disease is actually a crisis produced by the flare-up of a chronic miasm. Hahnemann suggested that staff administer acute absoric remedies for the crisis and then return to the administration of deep-acting antisorics. Hahnemann suggested the use of acute intercurrents during severe crises and chronic antisoric treatment for the underlying cause associated with sora. The following quote is from the Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 184-85. To remove the tendency to such outbursts, dangerous sore throats, pneumonia, ophthalmia, typhus fever, erysipelas, etc., that is, to effect a radical cure of sora requires the slow, specific action of the antisoric remedies. In the case of your wife, among other medicines, also Graphites, as you must give sulphur soon again. End of quote. In the Materia Medica Pura, Hahnemann published the provings of 67 remedies, of which 49 were plants, 16 minerals, and 2 animal remedies. In the chronic diseases, Hahnemann published the provings of 47 chronic antisoric remedies, of which 31 are minerals, 13 are plants, and 3 are animal remedies. The founder took 9 minerals, 7 plants, and 1 animal remedy from the Materia Medica Pura and listed them as antisorics. The new remedies included 22 minerals, 6 plants, and 2 animals. This shows that the emphasis on chronic treatment led to the proving of more mineral remedies. The antisoric remedies are dominated by elements of the periodic table, like potassium, sodium, magnesium, phosphorus, carbon, calcium, sulphur, chlorine, silica, and iodine. This includes important medicines like sulphur, calcarea, causticum, hypersulphuris, graphites, iodum, calicarbonate, natrum muriaticum, magnesia carbonica, silica, etc. The absoric remedies are mostly plant remedies like aconite, belladonna, hyoscyamus, stramonium, bryonia, chamomilla, colocynth, coffea, nux vomica, ipecac, ignatia, pulsatilla, rustox, and staphysagria. This offers a clue to the medicinal actions of the remedies of the mineral and plant world. In 1796, Hahnemann wrote that plant remedies produced the rapid alternation of primary and secondary symptoms during the provings. This means their symptoms are subject to quick alternations and the production of opposite states. The mineral remedies are more slow, fixed, and steady in their actions, and produce less rapid secondary symptoms. Plant remedies are also known for their quick onset and rapid actions, while the mineral remedies produce deep, long-lasting actions over time. This makes the absoric plant remedies more similar to acute diseases and crises caused by a flare-up of sora and the miasms. The mineral remedies are more similar to disease processes that are slow-moving and fixed, like the chronic miasms. There are antisoric plant remedies that produce similar deep actions in line with their mineral components. The animal remedies are quick-acting, but they also have deep, long-lasting actions depending on their mineral composition. The minerals are the basis of the plant and animal worlds. Proper chronic treatment removes predispositions to acute crisis because it removes their underlying causa prima. If the primary cause is not addressed, acute lacerbations will continue and become more dangerous until life-threatening secondary diseases are well established. The fast-acting absoric remedies are more suitable for the treatment of acute crisis because their symptoms are more similar to these states. The antisoric remedies are more slow and steady in their actions, making them more similar in the long-term degenerative symptoms of chronic diseases. The doctrine of Sora and the chronic miasms had a strong effect on Hahnemann's practice of homeopathy. In his early years, the founder taught that most diseases were of an individual nature, with the collective miasms playing a more limited role. Now he believed that the universal chronic miasms played a much larger role than previously understood. As these diseases are of common cause and similar symptoms, Hahnemann began to study them through the collective anamnesis. In the footnote to aphorism 78 of the Sixth Organon, Hahnemann wrote that Sora could be implanted, quote, through infection or heredity, unquote. This is the origin of the chronic genus epidemicus remedies, which are commonly called the antimiasmatic medicines. Now that he had discovered the collective nature of the universal chronic miasms, he began to place much more emphasis on the treatment of collective diseases. Hahnemann taught that Sora was the mother of all miasms, and that sulphur was the father of all antimiasmatic remedies. From this point on, sulphur and the other cardinal antisorics began to play a much larger role in his clinical practice. The founder's new methodology involved the study of the collective picture of the miasms, aphorisms 100 to 103, on a large group. Once a homogeneous group of antimiasmatic remedies were found, it was possible to use individualization to find which antisoric remedy, aphorism 82, was best for the patient. First, the collective anamnesis is used to find the most similar group of remedies, and then the individual anamnesis is used to find the personal remedy out of that group. The study of individual and collective diseases allowed the founder to see the bigger picture. Hahnemann's personal failures led him to believe that his early views were too limited to treat chronic diseases. Similia and individualization was now combined with the new classifications of homeopathic pathology, including inheritance, constitution, temperament, susceptibility, causations, and the collective study of the miasms. Some homeopaths were more secure with early homeopathy and could not adapt to these new changes. Hahnemann was well aware that his theories were ahead of the times. Shortly before the publication of his findings, he wrote Dr. Staff about the situation in a letter dated September the 6th, 1827. The following quote is from the Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 182. At least a year will elapse before the others get my book. They will require more than half a year before they recover from the fright and astonishment at the monstrous unheard-of thing. Perhaps another half year before they will believe in it. At all events, before they provide themselves with the medicines. And they will not be able to get them properly unless they prepare them themselves. End of quote. Hahnemann also realised that many of his followers were going to be surprised by the exceptionally small doses and high potencies he was suggesting. How many homeopaths were ready to use a minute dose of the decillianth, X30C, as a standard opening potency? The founder also requested that each dose be allowed to finish the duration of its action before the remedy is repeated. Could they wait and watch? Samuel had his doubts about this. The following quote is from the Life and Letters of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann by T.L. Bradford, page 182. then it is doubtful whether they will accept the smallness of the doses, and wait the long time they ought to allow each dose to act. Hence, 3 years from this time must elapse before they are able to do anything useful with them." End of quote. With such doubts about his own students, Hahnemann anticipated a, quote, "great uproar among the orthodox physicians and apothecaries." He knew that his work contained several controversial positions and dealt with areas of medicine that were well ahead of his time. To understand a sophisticated theory of infection that included miasms, primary states, latent stages, and secondary diseases was difficult for the rank and file. Epidemiology in homeopathy. The great experimenter was the first to teach the constitutional nature of skin disorders and how they progress into serious internal disorders, especially when suppressed. Some modern homeopaths do not realise that miasms are the acquired and inherited effects of infectious diseases. Hahnemann made it quite clear in On the Mode of Propagation of the Asiatic Cholera, 1831, that the cause of cholera miasm was a, quote, "enormously increased brood of those excessively minute, invisible, living creatures, so inimical to human life," unquote. From the Lesser Writings, page 758. The Chronic Diseases, 1828, is an early study of inheritance, constitution, temperament, susceptibility, infection, and collective diseases. The infectious miasms are collective diseases of common cause, fixed character, and similar symptoms. The case-taking method for collective disease is the genus group anamnesis, aphorisms 100, 101, and 103. The group anamnesis is the source of preventative and curative remedies for the acute and chronic miasms. Miasms are parasites that have the capability to breed in the human organism. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part, Nature of Chronic Diseases, footnote, page 75. Or have these various acute, half-spiritual miasms the peculiar characteristic that, after they have penetrated the vital force in the first moment of the contagion, and each one in its own way has produced disease, and then, like parasites, have quickly grown up within it. End of quote. Hahnemann says the acute miasms, quote, "die out and leave the living organism again free," unquote, if the patient lives through the attack and its sequels. Then he speaks about the chronic miasms. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases Theoretical Part, Nature of Chronic Diseases, footnote, page 75. On the other hand, are not the chronic miasmas disease parasites, which continue to live as long as the man seized by them is alive, and which have their fruit in the eruption originally produced by them, the itch pustule, the chancre, and the figwort, which in turn are capable of infecting others, and which do not die off of themselves like the acute miasmas, but can only be exterminated and annihilated by a counter-infection by means of the potency of a medicinal disease quite similar to it and stronger than it, the antisoric, so that the patient is delivered from them and recovers his health. End of quote. The founder was well aware of the use of the microscope in scientific investigations. He noted that some miasms have latent states that take years to develop secondary pathology. Stressful emotional and physical circumstances ignite the latent miasms, causing secondary pathology. The following quote is taken from the Chronic Diseases Theoretical Part, Nature of Chronic Diseases, footnote, page 98. The internal itch disease is, as before mentioned, of such a peculiar nature that it may remain, as it were, tied down and covered up for a long time through external favourable surroundings, so that a man may seem to the superficial observer healthy for years, even for many years, until circumstances unfavourable to the body or the soul, or to both, may arise and serve as a hostile impulse to awaken the disease slumbering within and thus develop its germs." End of quote. Hahnemann's original theory of the chronic miasms includes psora, the itch disease, psychosis, the figwort disease, and syphilis, the chancre disease. These miasms may be acquired through a primary infection, or their effects can be experienced through inheritance. The miasms include soft tissue infections caused by fungi, mites, and bacteria, as well as gonorrheal psychosis, tuberculosis, syphilis, AIDS, chronic infectious hepatitis, and endemic miasms like yaws, Lyme disease and malaria. See Chart 3.2, Cessante causa, cessant effectus. By the time he wrote The Chronic Diseases, Hahnemann was already of the opinion that the repetition of the same potency over a longer period of time did not work as well as exposing the patient to several degrees of potency. He suggested, for the most part, the lowering of the degrees of potency as the case progresses. For example, in the instructions on how to apply Thuja in psychosis, page 151, he suggested beginning with Thuja 30C, then progressing to lower the potency to 24C, 18C, 15C, 6C. In his dissertation on the treatment of psora, he suggests it is useful, safe, and often necessary to repeat the remedy in several different potencies. In the discussion of the treatment of psora, page 216, Hahnemann suggests that the use of a series of potencies going up and down the scale. Here he speaks of first giving the 30C, followed by the 18th, then perhaps the 24th, followed by the 12th and 6th, etc. Hahnemann started using this method to overcome the side effects of repeating the same potency too many times in succession. The repetition of the remedy in several potencies demonstrated a more gentle, prolonged action on the vital force. By this time, Hahnemann was preparing his medicines on small, poppy seed-sized pellets, so that he could administer smaller doses of his potencies. The size of his recommended dose is 1, or more rarely, 2 tiny pellets. Margaret Tyler opined that there were more than the classical miasms, but she did not rush to judgment. In the 1930s, she looked to the future, while holding on to the best of the past. The universal miasms of Hahnemann are very widespread, but they are not the only existing miasmatic diseases. Some miasms are opportunistic, and are usually found as secondary infections in compromised hosts. These make up the subcategories of the primary miasms. Other miasms are endemic to a locality or rely on a zoological host, therefore denying them universal status. There are 7 classes of miasmic kingdoms: the viral, bacterial, rickettsial, fungal, chlamydial, protozoan and worm. Most of these categories include both acute and chronic miasms. Reviewing the miasms in genus families offers a group picture as well as a characteristic signs of each peculiar subspecies. This offers knowledge of the group disease state and leads to similar remedies in individuals. Each of these 7 kingdoms has unique qualities and causes specific kinds of disease states. The miasmic symptoms always reflect the nature of the infectious agent, but the pathway of the disease modifies them. For example, the suppression of a skin infection favours the psoric symptoms, while the suppression of a lung infection favours pseudopsoric signs. The suppression of sexually transmitted bacteria tends to produce venereal syndromes like psychosis and syphilis. Suppressed chlamydia produces a syndrome more like psychosis than syphilis, showing a connecting point between the two states. Many disease states are based on multiple causations, environmental conditioning factors, and the predispositions of the constitution. This is why every patient must be treated as an individual by the symptoms of the disease-tuned vital force. The old doctor also pointed out that there are diseases of common cause and similar symptoms that affect homogeneous groups. Collective and individual suffering is combined in a patient suffering from the chronic miasms. These miasms are caused by a specific genus with relatively fixed symptoms throughout the ages. Examples of collective disorders include traumas, endemic nutritional disorders, and environmental diseases, and the infectious miasms. The miasms are social diseases that have had a great impact on culture and the human psyche, as well as affecting the health of generations. The Great Debate. Hahnemann's publication of the chronic diseases sparked off a great debate throughout the homeopathic and allopathic communities. There were three major types of reaction among the homeopaths. There were some, like Staff and Bonninghausen, who completely supported Hahnemann's new paradigm. The second group was more sceptical at first, but then accepted the basic premise through the application of its principles. This includes Hering, who was at first overwhelmed, but after examining the facts, became a staunch supporter. Grislet, who is mentioned in the Fifth Organon, was quite critical of the Sorder theory, but later in his life he wrote about it very positively. The overall opinion of many was that Hahnemann's teachings on the constitutional nature of skin disorders and suppression were worth their weight in gold. The third group completely rejected the entire affair out of hand without any serious investigation. Many of these individuals related more to the teachings of the early editions of the Organon, with their larger doses and lower potencies. They could not fathom Hahnemann's teachings on the vital force, dynamism, acute and chronic miasms, and the use of exceedingly small doses of the decillionth X30C potency. For some, the entire episode was too much, and they retreated into their old ways of practicing. Hahnemann's hypothesis involves 12 major themes. 1. Miasms are infectious diseases of common cause and similar symptoms that affect a homogeneous group. There are acute, half-acute, and chronic miasms. 2. All chronic miasms are constitutional in nature. Their effects can be inherited from one's ancestors or acquired by the individual. Hahnemann's universal chronic miasms are sora, psychosis and syphilis. 3. Chronic miasms have primary, latent and secondary or tertiary states. 4. The skin is intimately linked to the inner humours, tissues, vital organs and systems. 5. The suppression of skin lesions and other symptoms causes the miasms to mutate into new, increasingly destructive internal diseases. 6. The group anamnesis is a method for studying the symptoms of the collective miasmatic disorders in the populace. 7. The anti-miasmatic remedies must be similar to the essential nature of the complete chronic miasm. 8. The individual anamnesis is used to select the personal remedy out of the anti-miasmatic remedies. 9. Many so-called acute diseases and pathological crises are actually flare-ups of the chronic miasms. 10. Susceptibility to acute miasms and sporadic diseases is linked to the chronic miasms. 11. Acute remedies are more similar to acute crisis, while the anti-miasmatic remedies are more similar to chronic disease states. 12. Acute intercurrent remedies are prescribed by the exciting cause and active symptoms of crisis. Chronic remedies are chosen by the fundamental cause and the chronic symptoms. Hahnemann's chronic diseases present so many important ideas that countless homeopaths have been able to find useful information in the overall hypothesis. A few seasoned people understood the true ramifications of the founder's new theory of the collective miasms. A good number agreed that the skin was intimately connected to the humours and vital organs, and that suppression could cause serious internal disease. Although many accepted the basic premise of the constitutional nature of skin disorders, some found it very hard to believe psora was the cause of most chronic diseases. Some who supported the founder's new works thought his estimation of the percentage of psoric patients was exaggerated. Samuel, it appeared, had come to the conclusion that almost everyone had psora to one degree or another. As psora can be passed on by heredity and infection, its effects are bound to be very widespread. Homeopathic philosophy underwent great changes in the years 1817 to 1828. Hahnemann had expanded the law of similars to include the spheres of individual disorders and collective miasms. The introduction of a precise etiological theme with exciting, maintaining and fundamental causes took many by surprise. They were more used to the early organon where causation was questionable and each case was considered a unique singular disease. They opine that the introduction of the miasms and antimiasmatic remedies were contrary to the law of similia and individualization. Some allopaths took up a similar argument, saying that the introduction of the causal theory and specific remedies was evidence that Hahnemann had given up the basic philosophy of homeopathy. Such debates were circulating in all medical circles. One group of practitioners understood that psora was a constitutional disorder in theory, but in practice they found it difficult to treat all skin diseases by internal remedies alone. They still wanted to fall back on the application of creams, baths and soaps, especially in the treatment of scabies. Burnett later shared the opinion that scabies could not be treated with internal remedies alone and suggested that it was best to kill the mites as fast as possible. This seems rather odd, as my colleagues and I have been very successful in curing scabies with internal remedies, especially in the medicinal solution and split doses when necessary. Burnett, on the other hand, had only tried the dried dose. Burnett was critical of Hahnemann in places, but in general he showed great respect for the founder of homeopathy. Some claimed Hahnemann did not know that scabies was caused by a mite that bored superficially under the skin. They questioned how such things could affect the constitution. To them, psora was no more than an external skin lesion that should be dealt with externally. In Hahnemann's translation of Monroe's Materia Medica, 1791, the founder wrote that scabies had a, quote, living cause, unquote. In Anzeiger of Gotha, 1792, he taught that scabies is a living eruption that, quote, has its origin in small living insects or mites, unquote. Hahnemann suggested in the chronic diseases that sulfur in potency was capable of curing the fresh primary eruptions associated with the itch disease. Others did not realize that pimples, boils, tetter and herpes are also primary eruptions of psora capable of transmitting the disease to others. They did not understand that the psora hypothesis covers a reaction of the vital force to all soft tissue infections, including those caused by bacteria, fungi, viruses and mites. A number of observers opine that Hahnemann's miasms were a euphemism for an underlying chronic diathesis or constitutional state that demonstrates the nature of the inner terrain. The psora theory helped many focus on the importance of heredity in the processes of chronic diseases. They appreciated the teachings on underlying causes, susceptibility and latent states, and applied them in their own way. They understood that acute disorders and pathological crises are not independent from the constitutional ground from which they spring. Quite a few adopted the idea of acute and chronic remedies, but not all embraced the idea of apsoric and antipsoric medicines. Even some of those who rejected the miasm theory totally found that the new chronic remedies worked very well on constitutional states. Over time, a few practitioners separated the miasm theory from its causal basis and used it as a convenient system to classify innate predispositions. The miasm theory became an expedient way to differentiate groups of symptoms in chronic diseases. Some consider psora, psychosis and syphilis to be a trinity of innate patterns found in everyone. They equate the miasms with a triune power of archetypal forces and attribute all manner of phenomena to them. This assists them in sorting the symptoms and reviewing appropriate remedies in the materia medica. All of these insights have their value, but each only highlights one or another facet of Hahnemann's original hypothesis. After Hahnemann left for his heavenly abode in 1843, homeopaths like Bonninghausen, Herring, Wolff, Kent and J. H. Allen published additional studies on the chronic miasms. The treatment of chronic diseases. The advent of the psora doctrine caused major changes in Hahnemann's treatment strategies. The founder considered psora to be a collective disease that must be studied in a greater group of patients to find specific antipsoric medicines. He taught that suppression and drugging masks the outer symptoms and drives the disease inward, which causes serious conditions and weakens a vital force. Sometimes patients suffering from suppressed psora do not respond well to remedies chosen by the presiding symptoms. Sulphur has a peculiar power to remove suppressed psora from the centre to the circumference, bringing back the suspended symptoms and restoring vitality. This may be one of the major reasons why Hahnemann began many of his cases of psora with sulphur. From the years 1817 to 1828, Hahnemann worked tirelessly to construct a therapeutic system that would be suitable for the cure of chronic miasms. In the Organon, Hahnemann always made the point that if the totality of the symptoms cease, the cause of those symptoms also ceases. In the chronic diseases, Hahnemann turned this argument around by stating, quote, cessante causa, cessant effectus, unquote. When the cause ceases, the effects cease. The allopaths considered removing the eruptions of itch on the skin to be the cure of the disease. Hahnemann pointed out that by the time the eruptions of psora appear on the skin, the internal psora has already established itself in the inner organism. Removing the eruptions one-sidedly by topical medicines only suppresses the skin lesions and aggravates the internal psora, causing an increase of secondary symptoms. These secondary symptoms then appear as a great number of chronic degenerative diseases called by different names in the orthodox pathology books. Hahnemann also pointed out that these secondary diseases would also disappear once their internal cause, psora, was cured. In the first three editions of the Organon, Hahnemann suggested that under ordinary conditions, each dose of a homeopathic medicine should be allowed to act until its duration ceases. In the chronic diseases, he went to great lengths to explain this methodology in the treatment of chronic miasms. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases, Theoretical Part, psora, page 214. It is a fundamental rule in the treatment of chronic diseases to let the action of the remedy, selected in a mode homeopathically appropriate to the case of disease, which has been carefully investigated as to its symptoms, come to an undisturbed conclusion, so long as it visibly advances the cure, and the while improvement still perceptibly progresses. End of quote. Hahnemann points out that in many cases of a single dose of a perfectly homeopathic remedy can act on the patient for several weeks to months and complete the cure. He opines that one can do no better than this, no matter how many doses and remedies were given. In such a case, repetitions and changes in remedies only cause aggravations, relapses and spoil the case. In general, it is best for a homeopath to give a single dose and carefully wait and watch for a reasonable period of time before assessing the remedy action. Hahnemann notes, however, that there are cases which can, quote, exception to the rule, unquote, but he warns beginners to be very careful about repeating the dose prematurely. One of the principles of the chronic diseases is that the nature of the disease conditions the duration of action of homeopathic remedies. For example, a freshly arisen primary eruption of itch tolerates the repetition of the antisoric remedy much more rapidly than the secondary states of sora. This is because the primary stage of the miasms is the acute-like phase of a long-lasting chronic disease. Similar conditions include acute-like acerbations of a chronic miasm and pathological crises. During these acute-like stages, the disease state may require more rapid repetition of the remedies than in the slow-moving secondary stages. Hahnemann taught that sulphur was specific to the primary eruptions of sora and is often indicated at this stage of the disease. It was his experience that many cases can be cured by the administration of this remedy alone. There are some situations, however, where the practitioner needs to interpose hypersulphuris calcareum between the doses of sulphur as an intercurrent remedy. Once the sora has reached the secondary stage, it is rarely cured by sulphur without the aid of other remedies. Such conditions often require a series of antisoric remedies to complete the cure. Hahnemann noted, however, that when repeating antisoric remedies in tedious, chronic complaints caused by sora, quote, "It is nearly always necessary to give again from time to time during the treatment a dose of sulphur or of hyper according to the symptoms," unquote. In fresh eruptions of the itch disease, Hahnemann found that sulphur, hypersulpcalcareum and, in some cases, sepia were the most suitable remedies for immediate repetition. He also suggested that nux vomica or mercury might be useful as intercurrent remedies according to the time and circumstances. The details of this method were further clarified in the footnote to aphorism 246 of the fifth organon. In these notes it states that nux vomica is very useful as an intercurrent remedy during the repetition of sulphur, as it calms aggravations and prepares the vital force to receive further doses of sulphur. Mercury was used in a similar manner in cases where large doses of allopathic sulphur had been taken in the past. These passages were removed in the sixth organon, although Hahnemann's Paris casebooks show that he still used intercurrent remedies on occasions in the 1840s when using the LM potency. From 1828 to 1840, Hahnemann worked hard at overcoming the problems of a limited number of remedies and potencies. He was only working with around 50 well-documented antimiasmatic remedies. For this reason, the founder mastered zigzag prescribing because some of his remedies were partial simillimums. He had to know how to get the most out of a very small materia medica. Today, we have access to hundreds of well-proven chronic medicines, but only a few know how to use them properly against the chronic miasms. The medicinal solution in the chronic diseases. From the first organon, Hahnemann spoke about the necessity of giving a single dose of a medicine and not repeating the dose until there was a relapse of symptoms. He did not repeat a remedy until the duration of the preceding dose had ceased. Hahnemann was unhappy with the slow progress of the single-unit dose in many of his chronic patients. He wanted to find a way to elicit a deep healing action while avoiding aggravation, relapses, and accessory symptoms. This led Hahnemann to experiment with the delivery system of his homeopathic potencies. Over the years, he developed 3 delivery systems of the potentized remedy, i.e., the poppy seed-sized dry dose, the olfaction of medicinal vapours, and the medicinal solution. Based on such experiences, Hahnemann began to conduct new experiments with the medicinal solution in chronic diseases. In the first edition of the Chronic Diseases, he suggests administering the remedy as a split dose in aqueous solution rather than the single dose of globules. See Chart 3.3, Posology in the Chronic Diseases, 1828. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases Theoretical Part, Sora, footnote, page 217. In cases where the physician is certain as to the homeopathic specific to be used, the first attenuated doses may also be dissolved in about 4 ounces of water by stirring it, and 1/3 may be drunk at once, and the second and third portions on the following days. But it should each time be again stirred so as to increase the potency and thus to change it. Thereby the remedy seems to take a deeper hold on the organism and hasten the restoration in patients who are vigorous and not too sensitive." End of quote. In this method, 1 or 2 pellets of the remedy are placed in 4 ounces of water and stirred well to slightly raise the potency just prior to administration. This slight change of the potency level alters the remedy so that the organism never receives the exact same dose twice in succession. The following quote is from the Chronic Diseases Theoretical Part, Sora, footnote, page 234. If the medicine is to act more strongly, it must be stirred in a little more water until dissolved before taking it, and in still more water if it is to act still more strongly, and the physician should order the solution taken a portion at a time. If he orders the solution taken in 1 or 3 days, it must be stirred up not only the first time, but also the other 2 times, by which every part thus stirred acquires another somewhat higher degree of potency, and so is received more willingly by the vital force. To direct the use of the same solution for a greater number of days is not advisable, as the water kept longer would begin to putrefy. End of quote. Even as Hahnemann was developing the poppy seed-sized pellet dose, he was finding it difficult to utilise in certain cases. This led Hahnemann to apply the use of liquid solutions to the treatment of chronic disease and the miasms. Many homeopaths have used the medicinal solution in acute illnesses, but its application in chronic diseases has been largely ignored. Even when the medicinal solution is used, it is often in a glass without succussions or vigorous stirring. This does not produce the benefits associated with the Paris methods. In this paragraph from the Chronic Diseases, Hahnemann introduces the triple split dose. The medicinal solution is applied on 3 consecutive days in those patients who are fairly vigorous and not too sensitive. This technique is a forerunner of the method found in the 5th and 6th organon, in which Hahnemann often used a series of liquid doses followed by a period of waiting and watching. Some modern homeopaths are using the triple dose without the medicinal solution. They administer the first dry dose in 200 C, the second dose in 1 M, and the third dose in 10 M potency. Their idea is based on Hahnemann's experiments, but it does not include the breakthroughs of Hahnemann's advanced posology. The radical changes Hahnemann suggested were too progressive for some of the old homeopathic guard. Even Hahnemann's close students were overwhelmed by the introduction of homeopathic pathology and the chronic miasms. People needed time to digest the implications of the founder's new paradigm. Everyone was taken completely by surprise. The vital force in the 4th organon, 1829. The 4th organon, 1829, is the companion volume of the first edition of the Chronic Diseases, 1828. They share a similar philosophical view and case management strategies. In the 4th organon, Hahnemann began to integrate his teachings on the vital force found in the chronic diseases directly into the aphorisms. In the 4th edition, Hahnemann began to replace terms like body, organism, state of health, and other such words with the terms vital force, vital power, and vital energy. The first extensive introduction to the organon appears in the 4th edition under the title 1. Review of the Allopathy of the Old School of Medicine. See Chart 3.4, Introduction to the Fourth Organon, 1829, page 118. In this work, the founder reviews the history of medicine from the homeopathic view and explains the shortcomings of allopathy. The orthodox school maintained that their treatments were based on the actions of vis medicatrix naturae, the healing power of nature. For example, they claimed that, quote, nature, unquote, produced bleeding when there was plethora, so the physician should also bleed to cure plethora. They presented such ideas as examples of how one cured naturally by contraria contraris, opposites cure opposites. Hahnemann was deeply sceptical of such ideas and pointed out that what they called physis, nature, was only the activities of the instinctive, automatic, vital force when deranged by the forces of disease. Hahnemann wrote the following in the preface to the Fourth Organon. The following quote is from the Organon of Medicine, 5th and 6th edition, Dujenenborgi translation, preface to the 4th edition. That nature, whose self-help was alleged by the traditional school of medicine to be the incomparable healing art and the only thing worth imitating, is merely the individual nature of the organic man, is nothing but the instinctive, irrational, unreasoning vital force, subject to the organic laws of our body, which is ordained by the Creator to maintain the functions and sensations of the organism in marvellously perfect condition so long as the man continues in good health, but was not intended nor adapted for the restoration in the best manner of deranged or lost health. For, should our vital force have its integrity impaired by injurious influences from without, then this force strives instinctively and automatically to free itself from the adventitious derangement, disease, by revolutionary processes. But these very efforts are themselves disease. They are a second different malady, substituted for the original one. End of quote. Hahnemann made it clear that in his mind the orthodox school was mistaking the instinctive, automatic, unconscious actions of the mistuned vital force for nature herself. To understand the laws of healing, one must apply the reason-gifted mind to the natural processes that actually cure disease. The founder championed the idea that conscious intelligence must guide unconscious instinct in accordance with natural commandments. The following quote is from the Organon of Medicine, the 5th and 6th edition, Dujenenborgi translation, preface to the 4th edition. But as what has hitherto been termed healing art was a mere imperfect imitation of those unhelpful, useless, not infrequently injurious efforts and operations of this instinctive, unreasoning, vital force, misnamed nature, when left to itself in disease, it will, I think, be conceded that before me the true healing art was not discovered, but that homeopathy is this healing art, which had hitherto been sought for in vain. Its fundamental principles teach, its performances prove. End of quote. In these passages, Hahnemann makes one of his most controversial statements. That is the idea that the vital force is designed for preserving the state of health and is not well suited for the restoration of health during sickness. On the surface, such an assertion seems contrary to the teachings of Hippocrates, as well as the modern understanding of the immune system. This assertion outraged the orthodox physicians who considered themselves ministers of nature, and also confused some of Hahnemann's own followers. If one looks deeper, however, there are very valid observations behind this declaration. Hahnemann returns to this theme in the footnote to Aphorism 19 of the Fourth Organon. The following quote is taken from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, by Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833. Footnote 1, Aphorism 17. I have already shown in the introduction that this method is an imperfect imitation of the still more imperfect attempts made by the unintelligent vital powers, when abandoned to their own resources, to save themselves at all hazards, a power to which the organism was confided merely to preserve its harmony so long as health continued. However inapplicable this method may be, it has for so long a time been practiced by the existing school of medicine that the physician can no more pass over it unnoticed than the historian can be silent on the oppression to which mankind has been subject for thousands of years beneath the absurd rule of despotic governments. End of quote. The preface and introduction to the Fourth Organon states that in chronic diseases, the deranged vital force produces general reactions that tend to attack the healthy areas of the organism without being able to remove the original disease. Although the vital energy may remove moderate acute diseases through crisis, serious acute diseases more often than not end in death. These rather negative statements must be understood in the context in which they are given. That is, the disease-tuned vital force may not be the best indicator of how to cure. To cure effectively, gently, and permanently, the healing artist must study those rare but true cures carried out by nature herself. These ideas are integrated into the main text of the Fourth Organon in Aphorism 48. The following quote is from the Homoeopathical Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, by Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, Aphorism 48. The method we ought to adopt to cure diseases effectually, mildly and permanently is easily discovered by studying the proceedings of nature. These will teach us to avoid the course pursued by the unintelligent vital powers, which, like allopathy, tend always to attack the parts that are least diseased, and to excite a malady dissimilar to the primitive one, a proceeding that never effects a cure in chronic diseases, but always aggravates the evil, and which, in acute diseases that are not intense, removes them with difficulty, terminating almost always in death where they are violent and already dangerous in themselves. Here we may likewise learn to imitate those rare but real cures, Aphorisms 38 and 41, that are performed by the excitement of a new, morbific power whose effects resemble those of the primitive disease, and which, acting upon the body, destroy and remove the latter promptly. End of quote. It was Hahnemann's view that the healing artist should not blindly follow the instinctive reactions of the disease-tuned vital force, because they are part of the problem, not indications of how to cure. He even goes so far as to say that some of these attempts at self-healing are similar to allopathy, as they produce dissimilar states that damage the healthy parts, while aggravating the original disease through complications. This rather controversial idea has come of age as modern science confirms that most of the pathology that takes place in chronic diseases is caused by the organism's own deranged pro- and anti-inflammatory hormones and immune responses which damage the healthy parts of the organism. It was Hahnemann's view that the healing artists should use their God-given intelligence to observe nature more closely and understand that in the natural world, disease is cured by similar diseases. See Aphorism 49. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, by Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, Aphorism 49. These cures are, as we see, performed solely by means of homeopathy, which we have at length attained to by consulting reason and taking experience for our guide. Aphorisms 9 and 10. By this method alone can we cure disease in the most speedy, certain and permanent manner, because it is grounded upon the eternal and unerring law of nature. End of quote. Exciting and fundamental causes. Hahnemann's teaching on causation and the categorization of disease went through a radical change between 1805 and 1843. Nowhere are the changes in the homeopathic paradigm more obvious than in aphorism 5, 6 and 7 of the third organon, compared with 5, 6 and 7 of the fourth, fifth and sixth organon. The most important changes are found in aphorism 7 of the fourth edition, which later becomes aphorism 5 of the fifth and sixth editions. In his early years, Hahnemann taught that similia and individualization alone were sufficient to treat all diseases. The central causal doctrine of homeopathy at this time was to refute the concept of the primary cause and tolle causum, remove the cause, of the orthodox school. In aphorisms 5, 6 and 7 of the third edition, Hahnemann wrote that diseases, as such, are hardly recognizable in terms of inner changes, but certainly recognizable by their symptoms. In the footnotes he adds that the knowledge of the prima causa is non-important in the matter of healing. For this reason, the healing artist views sickness only in terms of the totality of the symptoms. Every medical practitioner knows the difficulty of finding the true cause of many disease states. Proximate cause often relates to an etiological constellation made up of several interdependent factors rather than one single cause. Other befourments seem to just happen for no observable or logical reasons. Even with the rapid development of modern sciences, studies at major institutions show that the diagnosis of the true cause of many diseases is still outside our grasp. Many causes are so hidden in the past they can only be witnessed in the signs and symptoms in the present. Hahnemann felt it was a mistake to take the internal changes that take place in the organism as the primary cause of the disease. For example, to say that fatty degeneration of the heart is the primary cause of heart attack is an illusion, as this is just another symptom of the disease. Why did the fatty degeneration appear in the heart and arteries in the first place? Is it because of inherited predispositions, emotional stress, smoking, poor diet, lack of exercise, obesity, or the presence of chronic miasms? Are these internal changes produced by any one of these factors, or a combination of all of them? To look at the pathological changes as the primary cause is only looking at the effects, not the true reasons for the development of the disease. To say the primary cause of a patient's disease state is a stomach, liver or kidney disorder is not only misleading, but also useless in finding a true curative remedy. What are the real causes behind these internal changes? What produce the original changes in function that ultimately lead to organic pathology in these vital organs? The true causes of such diseases are not found in the pathology of the body alone. Hahnemann continued to maintain that pathological changes in tissues, organs and systems are not the primary cause of disease. But at the same time, he introduced the homeopathic view of causation. For this reason, the paragraphs found in the third organon were replaced, and the text was updated in accordance with the new information presented in the chronic diseases. The most profound changes come in aphorism 7 of the fourth organon, which contains the major breakthroughs in the chronic diseases in a nutshell. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine or Organon of the Healing Art by Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the fourth organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 7. When a cure is to be performed, the physician must avail himself of all the particulars he can learn, both respecting the probable origin of the acute malady and the principal phases of the chronic disease, to aid him in the discovery of their fundamental cause, which is commonly due to some chronic miasm. In all researches of this nature, he must take into consideration the apparent state of the physical constitution of the patient, particularly when the affection is chronic, the disposition, occupation, mode of life, habits, social relations, age, etc., etc." End of quote. No longer was a discussion of etiology, based primarily on refuting the prima causa of the orthodox school. Now it was the homeopath's duty to study the exciting causes of acute diseases and the fundamental causes of chronic diseases, which are often based on the chronic miasms. In researching these areas, it is important to take into account the state of the physical constitution, the nature of the intellect and emotional disposition, as well as situational factors like occupation, lifestyle and habits, social relationships, age, etc. Hahnemann called these areas of human life the attendant circumstances, and considered them an essential foundation for understanding patients and the cause of their diseases. Case-taking in the fourth organon included an expanded study of the causal factors, chronic miasms, and concomitant symptoms related to constitution, temperament, and environmental factors. The approach found in Aphorism 7 is updated and transferred to Aphorism 5 in the 5th and 6th edition of the Organon. See Chart 3.5, Aphorism 7, Causation and Attendant Circumstances, page 123. By 1828, homeopathy was no longer a system based solely on similia and individualization. Now it was necessary to recognize individual and collective causations, as well as singular disorders and group diseases. At this time, Hahnemann spoke in terms of causes, miasms, symptoms, and attendant circumstances. Every area of the patient's life was assessed in order to understand the causal nature and attendant factors of the disease state, so that the totality of the symptoms would be as complete as possible. These themes would be expanded and included in more paragraphs in the 5th and 6th editions of the Organon. This presentation goes far beyond anything that Hahnemann wrote in the first 3 editions and bears witness to the fact that homeopathy had come of age. See Aphorism 8 of the 4th Organon. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the 4th Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, Aphorism 8. The unprejudiced observer, however great may be his powers of penetration, aware of the futility of all metaphysical speculations that are not confirmed by experience, perceives in each individual affection changes of general state of the body and mind, traces of disease, causalities, and symptoms that are discoverable externally alone, that is to say, deviations from the former sound state of health, which are felt by the patient himself, remarked by the individuals around him, and observed by the physician. The ensemble of these available signs represents, in its full extent, the disease itself, that is, they constitute the true and only form of it which the mind is capable of receiving. End of quote. There are those who tend to rely on metaphysical priori that are very hard to confirm by experience. They are always looking for a transcendental cause or symptom that will explain everything in a few words. These attempts are often based on subjective interpretations of a single person, rather than the objective facts visible to all. Hahnemann emphasized a Gestalt philosophy in which the whole was more important than the sum of its parts. In his view, it is the assembly of all perceivable causalities, disease traces, and symptoms found in the body and mind that make up the true portrait of the illness. By viewing the essential nature of the totality of the symptoms, the disease takes on the form of a holographic picture that may be seen from all sides and by every observer. In Aphorism 9, Hahnemann introduced a category called causa occasionalis, which are exciting and manifesting causes that need to be removed. This includes removing foreign objects by surgery, using stomach pumps or emetics to remove poisons, and other mechanical problems that need physical assistance. In cases where there are no such factors, Hahnemann writes, quote, "We can perceive nothing but the symptoms, then must these symptoms alone, with due attention to the accessory circumstances and the possibility of the existence of a miasm, guide the physician in the choice of a fitting remedy to combat the disease." Unlike the first 3 editions of the Organon, the last 3 editions all emphasize the need to assess the totality of symptoms, as well as the attendant circumstances, constitution, temperament, habits, lifestyle, relationships, sexuality, etc., and the chronic miasms, sora, psychosis, and syphilis. In the earlier editions of the Organon, Hahnemann opined that nature produces single, unique diseases in each individual that demand the complete individualization of each and every case. By the time of the 4th Organon, Hahnemann was equally sure that infectious miasms were collective social diseases based on a common cause. For this reason, he concluded that there were personal disorders and group miasms that demanded a different approach. To understand a collective disease like the acute and chronic miasms demands a much larger study. This is because each individual patient only shows one facet of the collective miasm, which does not provide the complete totality of the symptoms. To treat a collective disease, it is necessary to study the miasmic signs in a greater group of patients to find specific genus epidemicus remedies. Although early homeopathy addressed this issue in acute disorders, it was not until the 4th Organon that the need to study the chronic miasms in a similar manner was emphasized. Vide Aphorism 96. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the 4th Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, Aphorism 96. This method, so indispensable in epidemic diseases, which are for the most part acute, I have likewise thought proper to apply in a more rigorous manner than has hitherto been done to chronic diseases principally produced by a miasm that always retains its identity, and to sora in particular. In fact, it is necessary to search out the whole of the symptoms of these affections, since each individual they attack only presents a part of them, and the remainder must be sought for in other patients, so that, without having observed a great number of persons attacked with one of the chronic affections which belong to this class, it would not be possible to acquire knowledge of the totality of the symptoms that characterize them, or consequently of the homeopathic remedy which is appropriate to all their different stages and forms." End of quote. By 1821, Hahnemann was already studying the symptoms of the itch disease through the collective case history. He would carefully mark the potential symptoms of sora with NB in the margins of his casebooks. From these observations, it was possible for him to construct a group case based on the totality of the symptoms of the miasms found in hundreds of patients. This collective study brought out the group symptoms of sora in such a manner that it was possible to find chronic genus epidemicus remedies for antisoric treatment. For the chronic miasm to be cured, the remedy must have the potential to remove the totality of symptoms in all its stages and forms. If a remedy cannot treat the primary, latent and secondary symptoms of sora, then it cannot properly be called an antisoric remedy. The wait and watch method of the 4th Organon. In the 4th Organon, Hahnemann taught that the size of the dose should be kept as small as possible, and suggested the use of tiny, poppy seed-sized pellets as a medium for his remedies. At this time he started most cases with the 30C and then lowered the potencies to 24C, 18C, 12C and 6C, if and when needed. The founder gave careful rules regarding the repetition of the remedy and perfected what is often called, quote, the single dose, wait and watch method, unquote. This approach is clearly explained in aphorisms 242, 243, 244 and 245. See Chart 36, Single Dose Wait and Watch Method, page 126. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient in 1833, aphorism 242. So long, then, as the progressive amendment resulting from the dose continues, it must at least be admitted that in this case the action of the remedy has not yet ceased, and consequently no other medicine should be prescribed. End of quote. In the above passage, Hahnemann clearly explains that as long as there is a progressive improvement, one must assume that the duration of the remedy still continues. As long as the patient is getting better day by day and week by week, the repetition of any medicine whatsoever is forbidden. After this aphorism, the Hofrath proceeds to explain the nature of the work that can be accomplished by a single dose of an appropriate homeopathic medicine. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 243. To this we may add that when the remedy is perfectly homeopathic, the amelioration continues even after its action has terminated. The salutary operation does not cease immediately after the first remedy has exhausted its action, not even when several hours, and in chronic diseases several days, are suffered to elapse without administering another dose. That part of the disease which has already been destroyed cannot revive again, and the amendment would still be perceptible for a long time if even no more medicines were administered to the patient. End of quote. Hahnemann continues by explaining that the improvement produced by a well-selected remedy will continue for an intermediate period after the duration of the remedy ceases. This period may last for a few hours in an acute disorder to several days in a chronic disease. He notes that the symptoms of the diseases that have been truly cured will not return, and an increase in health will be observable for some time, even without additional medicine. This is the power of the single dose. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 244. When the progressive amendment arising from the first dose of the homeopathic remedy does not terminate in perfect health, which is rarely the case in acute diseases, a period of stagnation ensues, which for the most part is also the limit of the action of the remedy. Until this arrives, it would be acting without any reasonable motive or even advantage to the patient, and in direct opposition to the desire's object, as well as to the welfare of the sufferer, to make him take a fresh dose of the medicinal agent. End of quote. In the following paragraph, Hahnemann explains his reasons for forbidding all medicinal interventions until the amelioration reaches a standstill in every direction. He emphasized the fact that untimely intervention, even with a well-chosen remedy, runs the risk of producing aggravations and unhomeopathic medicinal symptoms that mix with the natural symptoms and delay the cure. If the prescriber does not recognise the nature of these signs and continues to give more medicine, there is a danger of causing a serious medicinal disease. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, Samuel Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 245. Even a medicine that had produced very salutary effects until a given time would only aggravate the state of the patient if repeated before the amelioration terminated in all its points. This would be an attack at an improper moment. In fact, the first dose, when its action, proportioned to the duration of the disease, is exhausted, has already done all the good that this remedy could till then accomplish. That is to say, it has brought back the health to the most favourable state it was possible to bring it. A second dose would now spoil this good result, for it would excite the appearance of the other non-homeopathic symptoms peculiar to the remedy. That is to say, it would create a non-homeopathic medicinal disease, which, joining itself to the rest of the symptoms of the natural one, would constitute a complicated malady of still greater intensity. In short, it would destroy all the good effects already produced by the former, or any that might be expected from it, and thus, at least, impede recovery. End of quote. The statements in aphorisms 242, 243, 244 and 245 are in harmony with what Hahnemann had written in the Chronic Diseases in 1828. The idea of giving a single dose and waiting until the improvement ceases in every direction before giving more medicine is commonly associated with, quote, classical homeopathy. Many of today's practitioners, especially those who use higher potencies like the 30C, 200C, 1M and 10M, use this method. The only exception to the wait and watch rule is when a remedy produces a dissimilar aggravation marked by new symptoms without causing any clear improvement. Hahnemann took this as a sign that the wrong remedy had been given and corrective measures were needed to regularise the case. This is explained in aphorisms 248 and 249. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, by S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 248. There is but one case where another medicine ought to be administered before the preceding one has exhausted its action. It is that where a dangerous disease, far from improving in the slightest degree, becomes on the contrary aggravated by the appearance of fresh symptoms. It is then evident that the medicinal substance administered in the first instance was not homeopathic to the existing disease. It is therefore necessary, even before it shall have finished its effects, to administer another which is more conformable to the actual state of the disease. End of quote. The appearance of new symptoms not appertaining to the disease under treatment is a sign that the patient has received the wrong remedy. In cases where there is no immediate danger, these symptoms will often disappear by themselves in a matter of minutes to hours in acute diseases, or a day or two in a chronic complaint. In dangerous cases, however, this is no time to wait and watch. A new remedy that suits the present condition must be given immediately without waiting for the cessation of the wrong remedy. The correct remedy for the presiding symptoms will regularise the case and start the process of amelioration. Hahnemann continues on this theme in aphorism 249. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 249. This mode of proceeding would be imperative in a still greater degree if, in any urgent case, the physician who watches the progress of things with attention perceives at the expiration of 6, 8 or 12 hours that he has made a mistake in the choice of the last remedy, because the patient grows worse and new symptoms declare themselves. In such a case it is not only allowed, but it is even a duty to repair the error he has committed by selecting another homeopathic remedy that is as appropriate as possible to the present state of the disease. Aphorism 161. End of quote. In the fourth organon, Hahnemann taught that after the first dose, the symptoms of the patient often change to such a degree that a new remedy is needed for the remaining complaints. He felt that if a remedy was well selected, it would eliminate all of the symptoms it was capable of removing in a single dose. He raises this idea in aphorisms 246 and 247. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the fourth organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 246 and 247. When the progressive amendment is stopped before the complete restoration of health, and what remains of the disease be examined with attention, we shall then find the group of symptoms not only diminished, but also changed to such a degree that the same remedy will no longer be homeopathic to it. And so, on each occasion, it will be necessary to select another, more suitable to the existing state of the malady. Aphorism 246. Consequently, when the first dose of the remedy, which has been well selected, does not effect a perfect restoration to health during the continuance of its action, which it seldom fails to accomplish in recent affections that develop themselves in a rapid manner, there remains nothing better to be done to annihilate what remains of the disease than to administer a dose of another medicine as homeopathic as possible to the totality of the remaining symptoms. Aphorism 247. End of quote. In these passages, he suggested that after the single dose, one usually finds that there has been some alteration of the symptoms suggestive of a new remedy. The case books of this period show that Hahnemann was only using around 60 remedies to treat most of his patients. With such a limited materia medica, it is not surprising that many of these remedies were partial simillimums that caused an improvement in some areas while not removing symptoms in others, calling for a new remedy. For this reason, it may take a series of remedies to complete the cure. This method is called zigzag prescribing because the improvement proceeds at oblique angles rather than being a straightforward affair. In Aphorism 250, Hahnemann presents a similar observation in the case of chronic diseases, which were often based on chronic miasms. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the fourth organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 250. In chronic diseases, particularly at the commencement, it seldom happens that it would be good to administer 2 doses of the same remedy successively, not even if the second were delayed till the action of the first had terminated. If the first dose has done some good, the amendment produced will continue for some time, and in general there is no indication that would call for a repetition of the same medicine, because that which has not been improved by the power of a first dose will not yield to a second of equal strength, or even to one that is yet stronger. End of quote. A single remedy in a single dose is often all that is needed in a recently developed disease state. But in more protracted chronic diseases, this is usually not the case. A chronic case may need a series of remedies that are administered over a longer period of time. Hahnemann seems to believe at this time that whatever symptoms remained uncured by a single dose of a remedy would not be cured by a second or third dose. The only exceptions to this general rule were the repetition of sulphur, hypersulphuris calcareum, and, to a lesser degree, sepia, as expressed in the chronic diseases. Hahnemann repeated these cardinal antisorics, sometimes alone, or with the interpolation of intercurrent remedies to calm the vital force and prepare the organism for further doses. The information in paragraphs 247, 248 and 250 of the fourth organon was replaced in the fifth edition with instructions on when to allow a single dose to act alone and when to repeat the same remedy to speed the cure. It appears that by 1833, Hahnemann found that he could gain more benefit by carefully repeating the same remedy than he thought possible in 1829. This may have been because of the advent of more experience, new remedies, new reference works, and the increased use of olfaction and liquid doses. The changes in these paragraphs will be discussed in the following chapter, the Homeopathy of the 1830s. Posology methods and delivery systems. In the fourth organon, Hahnemann discussed administering remedies in the form of dry pellets, in aqueous solutions, and by olfaction. See Chart 37, Posology in the fourth organon, 1829. In the chronic diseases, he spoke of using solutions under specific conditions, but in the fourth organon, he opined that remedies work better, in general, in liquid. In some cases, he would add a small amount of water to the pills in a teaspoon, and at other times he would dissolve the pellets in a glass of water and give the patient portions of the solution. Hahnemann even goes so far as to say that pills should be rejected as their action on the living tissues is, quote, vague and uncertain, unquote. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the fourth organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 269. As the certain and comparative effects of medicines are never more easily ascertained than when they are administered in a solution, the physician ought consequently to employ all medical substances in a soluble state when their constitution does not absolutely require them to be given in a form of powder. All the other forms in which medicines have, till the present time, usually been enveloped, such as pills, electuaries, etc., should be rejected, because their action upon the living fibre is vague and uncertain. End of quote. Hahnemann was very precise about the size of the dose in the fourth edition of the Organon. He describes a process where 1 drop of a dynamization is placed on 300 tiny poppy seed-sized pellets, making each pill 1/300th of a drop. He suggests that one of these pills placed on the tongue is a sufficient dose for the patient. He also adds that those who are sensitive should receive the dose by olfaction, which he considered one of the smallest doses possible. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the fourth organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, footnote 1, aphorism 283. The best mode of administration is to make use of small comfits or globules of sugar, the size of a poppy seed. One of these globules having imbibed the medicine and being introduced into the vehicle forms a dose containing about the 300th part of a drop, for 300 of such globules will imbibe 1 drop of alcohol. By placing one of those on the tongue and not drinking anything after it, the dose is considerably diminished. But if the patient is very sensitive, and it is necessary to employ the smallest dose possible, and attain at the same time the most speedy results, it will be sufficient to let him smell once to a vial that contains a globule the size of a mustard seed, imbibing the medicinal liquid attenuated to a very high degree. End of quote. One small pill placed on the tongue only comes in contact with a smaller surface area of the organism. The liquid dose, however, contacts a larger number of nerves that transmit the power of the remedy to the vital force. This is also true with olfaction, as the fumes of the remedy come in contact with the olfactory nerve to the brain, the sinuses, and the tissues of the lungs. Hahnemann notes that in theory, one might imagine that the use of medicines in liquid would weaken medicinal action, but in practice the opposite is true as far as homeopathic remedies are concerned. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 284. By the same reason, the effect of a homeopathic dose is increased when we augment the quantity of liquid in which it is dissolved to administer it to the patient, although the proportion of the medicinal substance remains the same. But then the remedy comes in contact with a much more extended surface, and the nerves that feel its effects are far more numerous. Although theorists have asserted that the extension of the medicine in liquid weakens its action, experience proves the reverse, at least as far as regards homeopathic remedies. End of quote. Hahnemann continues with the same theme in aphorism 286, where he explains the penetrating effects of remedies given in liquid. He suggests that the liquid remedy is rapidly transmitted from the sensitive parts, replete with nerves, to all other parts of the organism. He calls this remedial action, quote, spiritual, unquote, in the sense of a dynamic or virtual effect on the vital force. The following quote is from the Homeopathic Medical Doctrine, or the Organon of the Healing Art, S. Hahnemann, translation of the Fourth Organon by Charles H. Devrient, 1833, aphorism 286. The action of liquid medicines upon the body is so penetrating, it propagates itself with so much rapidity and in a manner so general from the irritable and sensitive part, which has undergone the first impression of the medicinal substance, to all other parts of the body, that we might almost call it a spiritual, dynamic or virtual effect. End of quote. In the chronic diseases, Hahnemann recommended the use of 1 or 2 small pellets as an appropriate dose. This set the standard for the use of the dry dose, which is still the most common method of giving remedies today. In the Fourth Organon, however, Hahnemann stated his preference for the administration of remedies in a liquid, although he was yet to give the exact details how this was to be carried out. The founder also pointed out that olfaction was an excellent method for administering remedies to those who are sensitive. So in this work, Hahnemann reviews 3 methods of administering remedies, i.e. as dry pellets, in liquid solutions, and by inhalation. In the chronic diseases and the Fourth Organon, the founder taught that as long as there was amelioration of the symptoms, the repetition of the remedy was counterindicated. The repetition of the remedy was allowed only after there was a clear standstill in the improvement of the symptoms in every direction. Hahnemann restricts potency to 30C. By the 1820s, Hahnemann was convinced that the actions of the 30C were truly more powerful than the low potencies he had previously administered. As he was now confronting the chronic miasms, he was searching for more powerful methods of overcoming the obstacles to the cure. For this reason, the founder began to experiment with higher potencies of the cardinal anti-miasmic remedies. Hahnemann's early use of potencies above the 3C is recorded in the second edition of the Materia Medica Pura, 1826, in his lecture on Thuja. The following quote is from the Materia Medica Pura by Samuel Hahnemann, Volume 2, Thuja, page 649. As the figwort gonorrhea is one of the few permanent miasmatic diseases, I was able to test in the most certain manner the degree of efficacy of the higher dilutions of Thuja juice. Thus I found that even the higher dilutions, e.g. the decillion fold or even the vigacillion fold dilution, 1/XX, made with 60 diluting vials, each of 100 drops. If each diluting vial was succussed 10 times and oftener, that is, with 10 or more shakes of a powerful arm, was not weaker in power than the less diluted preparations, nor, on account of the enormously diminished arithmetical fraction, had it sunk to complete powerlessness, to nothing, but, on the contrary, it had rather become even more intensely charged with the medicinal virtue of Thuja. End of quote. In this quote, Hahnemann discusses the use of the decillionth, 30C, and the vigacillionth, 60C potencies. The fact that Hahnemann was making higher potencies with 10 or more succussions did not go unnoticed by his students. By 1829, some of Hahnemann's pupils began experimenting with their own potencies above the 30C. One of the principal members of this group was Dr. Gustav Adolf Schritter, 1803 to 1864, who was born in Lenschau, Upper Hungary, in 1803. His father was a respected allopathic physician who provided his son with a quality education. With his father's support, Gustav attended medical school in Vienna, where he received his diploma in 1826. After his graduation, Gustav's father planned a 2-year scientific pilgrimage to France and Germany, where he requested his son to study homeopathy. At first, Gustav was a little reluctant to take on such a journey, but in 1826 he travelled to Leipzig to study homeopathy with Samuel Hahnemann. In 1828, Dr. Schritter returned to Lenschau to start a practice from where his reputation spread throughout Eastern Europe. After the successful treatment of a Polish countess, he was invited to Lemberg, Poland, which is now part of the Ukraine. Not sure how to proceed, the young doctor asked Samuel Hahnemann for advice. Hahnemann wrote back and said that Schritter, quote, as a faithful disciple of homeopathy, should introduce and spread the new curative method in the interest of science and of suffering humanity, especially in those countries in which no ray of the truth had yet penetrated. Unquote. Taking this counsel to heart, the young doctor moved his practice to Poland, where he became known as Dr. Schritter of Lemberg. Following on the information Hahnemann published in 1826 in the Materia Medica Pura, Dr. Schritter began to experiment with making potencies that were above the 30C recommended by Hahnemann in the Chronic Diseases and Organon. When Hahnemann was informed of these new experiments, he was worried that his students were going too far, too fast. He knew that the higher potencies were, quote, more intensely charged, unquote, than the lower potencies, and he was concerned about their potential for producing strong aggravations. Hahnemann writes that he had made Thuja 60C with 10 or more succussions per dilution. But in the same article, he states that he now only uses 2 succussions in order to prevent aggravation. The following quote is from the Materia Medica Pura, S. Hahnemann, Volume 2, Thuja, page 649. In order to obtain real preparations of sufficiently developed, but at the same time suitably moderated power, for even the more and most sensitive patients, by the dilution of the medicinal substances for homeopathic use. For some time back I have adopted the plan, in the case of all fluid medicines, of succussing each dilution vial with only 2 strokes of the arm." End of quote. So at this time, Hahnemann was not worried that his potencies were too weak, but that they were too strong, especially on those who were highly sensitive. The founder was working hard to find a perfect balance between remedies that were powerful enough to remove the chronic miasms, yet gentle enough to avoid unnecessary aggravations. Hahnemann wondered what would happen if everyone starting using different degrees of potency made in different ways with varying numbers of succussions. In September the 12th, 1829, Hahnemann wrote a letter to Dr. Schreiter, which was later published in Staff's New Archive for the Homeopathic Healing Art, Volume 3, Part 2, page 182, 1846. The following quote is from Samuel Hahnemann, His Life and Work, Richard Hale, Volume 1, page 322. "I do not approve of your potentizing medicines higher than to X11 and XX. There must be a limit to the matter. It cannot go on indefinitely. But by definitely deciding that homeopathic medicine should all be diluted and potentized up to X, 30th centesimal, a homogeneous process arises in the cures of all homeopaths, and if they describe a cure, we are able to work after them in the same degree, since they are operating with the same tools as we are. Then our enemies cannot reproach us with having nothing definite, no fixed standard." End of quote. In this letter, Hahnemann requested that the 30C become the standard potency for clinical applications. One of the main reasons for this dictum was his concern that his opponents would claim that homeopathy has no fixed standards and was therefore unscientific. For this reason, he recommended that all homeopaths should use the 30C potency so that they could present uniform medical studies. Another factor was that Hahnemann was ridiculed for the use of the decillionth, and he wondered what his critics would say about using even smaller fractions of medicine. This letter must have come as a surprise to Dr. Schreiter, as Hahnemann had already published the results of his own experiments with the 60C. The idea that all homeopaths should use the 30th potency did not go down well with most of Hahnemann's students. Many felt that each homeopath should go by their own experience when it came to the choice of potency for their patients. Some preferred the lower potencies like the 6th or 12th, and others wished to experiment with degrees higher than the 30C. Dr. Schreiter continued to experiment with high potencies and eventually used dynamizations as high as the 200th. The editor of the archive, Dr. Staff, added a note to the letter saying that it is well known that Hahnemann later changed his views on this subject. The Limit Maker. The period around the publication of the Fourth Organon, 1829, was a time of great transformation in the philosophy and causal doctrine of homeopathy. The teachings of the chronic diseases and the chronic miasms were integrated into the text of the Fourth Organon, and many antisoric remedies were introduced. At the same time, Hahnemann was working hard to remove any complications that remained in his new medical system. For this reason, he made several changes in the areas of pharmaceutical production, case management strategies, and posology procedures. First of all, he limited the number of succussions given to the pharmaceutical potency to 2 in order to modify the power of the increased number of dilutions. Then he limited the amount of the dose to 1 or 2 poppy seed-sized pills given dry or by olfaction or in liquid solution. He did this because the drop doses of the stock potencies were causing too many unnecessary aggravations and accessory symptoms. He recommended the use of the single dose and emphasized the problems caused by untimely repetition. He suggested that each remedy be given only one time and not repeated in most cases. Hahnemann also wrote letters limiting the potency at 30C made by the instructions of the organon in an effort to maintain a uniform standard for homeopathic remedies. In some ways, the fourth organon may be called the limit maker, because Hahnemann placed new restrictions on the homeopathic system to control the rapidly expanding power of the remedies.